You're a grocery clerk, here to collect a bill. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 81 of Movies Are Awesome, the show all about crossword puzzles. My name is Nathan Pottle, and thank you for joining me today, and it is the Halloween season, so I thought, why not talk about a Halloween-type movie, a horror movie, or a scary movie, or something kind of in between, who knows, and my favorite of horror movies is Psycho. So that's what I'm talking about today. One quick thing I want to mention, though, before I get into Psycho, is that I believe it was yesterday that the show crossed 4,000 downloads, which is pretty cool, if I may say so. So we're at 4,000 downloads across the first 80 episodes. That's about 50 downloads per episode if you're keeping track, which I am at least a little bit. I want to know how many people are out there listening. I find it very cool that there are people out there who listen to the show and really enjoy it. So that's pretty cool. We're at 4,000 downloads, kind of a landmark number, and it feels good, you know? So thank you everyone out there who's been listening to the show and has been enjoying it. Today, we're getting on to topic here. We're talking about Psycho. Now, this is directed by Alfred Hitchcock and came out in 1960, and this movie is pretty big and pretty famous. They made an entire movie about the making of this movie. It's called Hitchcock. It came out a couple years ago. I actually haven't seen it because I didn't think there was anything in that movie that could tell me what I didn't already know. I know this movie pretty well. This movie's very famous. There's a whole lot of information and trivia about the making of this film and all the money that it made and how popular it was and the secrecy behind it all. And I'm going to talk about all of that stuff. We're going to talk also about the merits of the film itself, not just the behind-the-scenes type things. Now, normally, when I do a review of a movie this old, I normally don't worry about spoilers. Today, I'm going to worry about spoilers a little bit. So we'll do a non-spoiler section, and then when we get about halfway through, when I get through my non-spoiler notes, I'll give a warning. I'm going to say, hey, if you have not seen Psycho, I don't want to ruin it for you. Odds are, you probably already know what's going on in this movie. If you haven't seen it, you've at least heard of stuff. But I don't want to be that person to ruin the experience for you. So when I get to the point that I'm going to talk about spoilers, I will give the warning, and then we're going to move into that. So why don't I just get started? Let's talk about Psycho. Like I said, this is directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and what's interesting is that he shot this movie for less than $1 million. Now, it is said that Alfred Hitchcock was kind of sick of doing his big budget, famous actors type movie, so he went back to his roots and he did a TV type style shoot. It was a very small crew, very fast paced. They did shoot about 9 days over schedule. I can't remember the exact number of days that this was supposed to be shot in, but they were 9 days over schedule, which is not a huge deal, and for less than $1 million, that's totally fine. Can't remember if I mentioned it or not already, but this movie did come out in 1960, was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. It didn't win any of them. I've probably mentioned it on the show before, but Psycho came out the same year as Billy Wilder's The Apartment, which is also a very good movie. So it didn't win anything because it was going up against The Apartment, which I do think is better than Psycho. So if you haven't seen The Apartment, you should check that out. Maybe I'll do a review of it one day, but I'm not talking about that movie today. Let's talk about Psycho. First, I'm going to give just a quick rundown of kind of what the story is without really giving anything away. So we start with this character of Marion Crane, and she is played by Janet Leigh, who, as I understand, was a famous actress at the time. She was a headliner. I don't really know her from anything else, but from things that I've read, it seems like she was famous and well-known at the time. So her character of Marion Crane, she is sneaking around with this other gentleman who goes by the name of Sam Loomis, and they're meeting at hotels and just having a good time with each other, and she decides that, hey, we need to get married. We can't just be sneaking around doing all this stuff. And he's like, okay, well, maybe we'll get married one day. Maybe. But at the same time, he's saying that he really likes her and he loves her, and they want to have a life together, but they can't be sneaking around anymore. She works for this real estate company, and her boss brings in this rich client who has all of this money, and he slaps $40,000 in cash in front of her, and he's like, hey, go take this to the bank because I'm buying a house for my daughter and this money needs to be in the bank. So she gets tasked with all this money. Now, in 1960, $40,000 is the equivalent of about $120,000 when you account for inflation. For us, imagine being handed $120,000 in cash and asked to take it to the bank. Well, it'd be awfully tempting to run away with it, and that's exactly what Marion Crane does. She takes this money and she runs. And when she runs away, she meets some people and does some things, and that's all I'm going to give you as far as the basic story plot of this movie, because I don't want to give anything else away other than that. So while I'm talking about Janet Leigh, why don't I talk about her performance in the first place? So her performance is really excellent. I would say she probably gives the second best performance of the movie, and the movie really does focus on her a lot. So we get a lot of time with her, and she really gets to shine and display who she is as a person and how she's corrupted by this money. And she runs away with it, and she's pleased that she got away with it and all of this stuff. So she's kind of being corrupted by this money. And what's really interesting is that the cinematography of this movie really focuses on people's eyes. Now, if you look at people's eyes, a lot of people say it's the window into the soul, and people can be really expressive with their eyes, and that's very true for Janet Leigh as an actress. She does a lot with her eyes in this movie, especially there are scenes when she has the money and she's on the run and she's just driving her car. But we get close-ups of her face and voiceovers of what is going on in the aftermath of her stealing this money, and she's thinking about all the people that she's duped and turned over, and she's sadistically pleased with having gotten away with it, and she says it all with her eyes, and she has this tiny little smirk on her face, but it's a very captivating shot to look at, and just to see her face, and oh my goodness, it's chilling just to think about it and look at it, because her eyes are very intense in this particular moment, and they are in other parts of the film as well, but the eyes are such a focus of this movie. When you watch it again, or if you haven't seen it and you watch it for the first time, really pay attention to the main character's eyes and what they're doing with their eyes and where they're looking and how they're looking at things, because it's hugely important in what's going on in the main picture of this film. We have a couple of other notable performances. I would say first and foremost is Anthony Perkins, who plays the character of Norman Bates, who is one of the people that Marion Crane meets along the way. He is very good in his role. He plays the owner of a motel that she stops in for the night, and when he's on screen, he's just completely captivating. His character likes to munch on candy corn, so he's always popping back candy corn, and he's chewing, and he does really interesting things with his eyes as well. Very intense, very focused. The way he looks at Marion and the way he looks at just other people in general, it's unsettling as to what is going on in his mind. What is he thinking? What is he doing? What's his relationship with Marion? What is going on? I'm realizing just how difficult it is to talk about this movie without giving things away. But I'm just thinking about these eyes. It keeps coming back to me again and again. There's even one scene in particular where Norman Bates, it appears that he has some eyeliner on his eyes that really accentuate exactly what he's doing and how he's staring at things. And that scene in particular, it's quite chilling. Every time he's on screen, he dominates the screen. It's a wonderful performance. We also have Vera Miles, who plays Lila Crane, and John, what is his name? What did I write here? John Gavier? Oh boy, I can't even read my own writing today. John Gavin. That's what it is. John Gavin plays the character of Sam Loomis, who is Marion Crane's lover. Now, they all have different parts to play in the plot of this story, and they're pretty good performances for the most part. What I do want to talk about, though, instead of the plot and specifics, the strengths of this movie really come from the cinematography and the music. Now, specifically, the cinematography, this movie is in black and white. Color was very popular at the time. However, because the studio wanted this movie to be shot so cheaply, Alfred Hitchcock decided, hey, let's go in black and white. It's going to be cheaper. Also, I think it's going to be too gory for being in color, so let's keep it in black and white, and then that way the audience won't be so reviled as to the ongoings of the film. Every time we get to a violent moment, because it's in black and white, it's not going to feel as violent, where the audience is going to be a little more accepting of it. And I'll get to how the audience reacted to this movie in a little bit. But as a whole, the cinematography is fantastic. I've already mentioned the focus on eyes. The black and white looks very dynamic, very crisp. There's a lot of the rule of thirds going on in the composition of these shots. We have either Norman or Marion Crane being put in the lower left and right hand corners of the screen, and a lot of empty dead space going on here. This makes for really dynamic looking images, really captivating images. We also get a lot of long continuous takes. There's one in particular that I want to talk about in the spoiler section, but one that I can talk about right now is that when Marion takes the money, we get a shot of her. Now, the very first time we see her in the movie, she's wearing just a bra and bottoms, and her bra is white. After she steals the money, she's wearing a black bra now. And this is the scene that I'm talking about. She's wearing a black bra and walking around, and you see the money on the table. You see she's packing a bag. You see that she's in a hurry doing it. This entire scene has zero dialogue, but from this, you understand that she's stolen the money and she's leaving town. And she's doing it in a hurry. She wants to get out of town as soon as possible. That's how we're told that she's stealing this money and running. It's all 100% visual. And it may sound like I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but I love visual storytelling. Movies are a visual medium, so anytime we get as much information through just what we're seeing, that's what I love. That's what's great about this medium, just how you can be shared information through just visuals and not being told things and beaten over the head with things. I want to be shown something. That's why I watch movies. If I want to listen to something be explained to me, I'll put it on a podcast, which I do enjoy podcasts, but when I watch a movie, I want visual. When I want audio, I'll go for a podcast. And that's just how I like to intake those different mediums, you know? It makes sense. Going back to cinematography, though, we do get some other really interesting dynamic shots that move like up a staircase, and then all of a sudden we're in an upper angle looking directly down at this staircase. It's a very slow moving shot, very interesting in what's going on in this shot. It happens a little later in the movie, so I don't want to get into the specifics of what's going on there, but it's just so gorgeous to look at this movie. And maybe gorgeous isn't the right word, but dynamic is absolutely the word I want to use here. Instead of gorgeous, I'm going to go with dynamic. This is a very well laid out and well shot film. Now, as great as the cinematography is for this movie, what's even better is the music. I cannot remember the name of who scored this movie, but it was done entirely with string instruments. Alfred Hitchcock has said more than once that 60% of the movie's effect is all because of the score and how it brings you in and draws you in and creates that sense of terror. Everything is done through the score. Now, there's one very famous scene in this movie that I'm going to talk about more in the spoiler section, but originally, Alfred Hitchcock wanted that scene to have no music at all, but the composer, he decided to score it anyway. And when Alfred Hitchcock heard the music that he came up with for that scene, he was like, yep, 100%, throw that in the movie. It has to be in there. That is excellent. The score is so good. I just rewatched this movie last night, so I'm thinking about the music in my head. I'm thinking about all the cinematography. Oh my goodness, this movie is just so good and edge of your seat. I wouldn't say it's the most suspenseful of Alfred Hitchcock's movies. It's definitely his most horrific, if that's the word I want to say. This movie is technically a horror. However, it's a horror that came out in 1960. So by today's standards, this movie is not frightening in any sense of the word. But at the time in 1960, when it came out, audiences were revolted by what they were seeing on screen. There were people throwing up in aisles. There were people passing out and fainting. Some of the reactions to this movie were very volatile. And even we have one very famous quote about a negative reaction to this film, and it was a couple of years after this movie came out that Alfred Hitchcock wanted to do some filming in Disneyland, and Walt Disney said, "Absolutely not. Alfred Hitchcock is not allowed to shoot on my property because he made that disgusting film Psycho." That's what he said. So even someone as innovative and groundbreaking as Walt Disney was not having any of Alfred Hitchcock and his crazy antics in this movie. Now, lucky for us, a lot of people really liked this movie and were really gripped by it. We got a lot of sequels that are not that good. We got a spin-off TV series that came out a while ago that I didn't really enjoy, but we have that one gem of a movie, that original masterpiece. Now, when this movie was being made, like I said, they wanted to shoot it very cheaply because the studio didn't believe that this movie would do well at all. So what Alfred Hitchcock did is, normally his fee for directing a movie was $250,000. He said he would waive that fee in favor of 60% of the box office take. Now, the studio was like, "This movie's going to fail, you're not going to make any money, that's an amazing deal." And they shook hands on it and the deal was done. This movie was so hugely popular that Alfred Hitchcock ended up making over $15 million from his take of the box office share. And in today's dollars, that's about $120 million that he got away with because the studio just had no faith in this movie. And it came out swinging and everyone flocked to go see it. There was a lot of hype around this movie. What is going on in this film? So there's a lot of hype then. There should be hype now. We're 60 years later. This movie is 60 years old already, and I think it's still as engaging and interesting and dynamic, and the performances are engaging. I have very little negative things to say about this movie. I think that I think we have a couple of performances that aren't as good as the rest, but other than that, this movie is fantastic. It's wonderful. I try to watch it every year for Halloween. I didn't get to last year because of just reasons. But after watching it last night, there's no doubt in my mind, this is my favorite horror movie. This is my favorite scary movie. And really, I don't like horror movies all that much. It has to be really good quality for me to be even consider watching it. Like, the reviews have to be really upper tier before I'll even consider watching a horror movie. So a movie like Psycho, I believe it's like 97 or 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's very well reviewed, and with good reason. It's a very well put together film. It's very well made, and it's absolutely worth watching, especially around Halloween. So if you have not seen Psycho, I would recommend watching it this Halloween. When this episode drops, it's going to be October 30th, so Halloween will be tomorrow if you're listening to this on the first day that it's released. So find yourself a copy of Psycho, get it from the library, or order it online, or there's some way to watch it, I'm sure, but it's really a top-notch horror film, and I would recommend watching it. If you have seen Psycho, though, I'm going to talk about spoilers and some of my opinions on what I think about the spoiler side of this movie. So why don't I get started with that right now? And what I want to talk about first and foremost is Norman and Norma. Now, the idea that a split personality villain is so good. Obviously, we've had split personalities in other characters before. Like, obviously, Gollum in the Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings came out in the 1950s, and this came out in 1960. So that might have been some kind of inspiration. From what I understand, Norman Bates was inspired by a real-life serial killer, who was so vile and so evil. I guess he inspired a bunch of other movie killers as well, like Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, and there are some other ones too. I think Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre was also an inspired by this real life serial killer person. I don't know the name of the serial killer, and I didn't bother looking it up and writing it down. I don't believe in the glorification of sadistic people like that, so it's not even worth knowing their name. But I find it very interesting that his mother's half of the brain takes over his personality and kind of puts Norman off to the side, and now it's only Norma. And that's terrifying to think about that your mind can be split and then can be lost. And now Norman just doesn't exist anymore. And that's crazy to think about and scary to think about, especially when the dominant personality is someone who's as domineering and controlling and manipulative and sadistic. So when we're dealing with a mind like this, it's really creepy stuff. And I think that's part of the appeal and the terrified nature of this movie, is really part of everything that's going on within Norman Bates' mind. Now, I already talked about how audiences were kind of shook by this movie and all of their different reactions. And the reason is because of the shower scene. Now, everybody knows about the shower scene. I have no doubt that if you have not seen Psycho and you're still listening here, you know about the shower scene. Now, this is where Marion Crane is murdered in the shower. She is stabbed to death by Norma Bates, who is in the body of Norman Bates, and just stabbed and stabbed and stabbed, and then she falls over and she's dead. Now, she might not be 100% dead, because when you see the shot of her up close with her dead face on the floor, you can see her throat moving. You can see she still has a bit of a pulse there, and that's just because, obviously, the actress was alive. So whether Marion Crane was fully dead or not in that moment, not 100% sure. But going back to the cinematography of the eyes, we get a really close-up shot of her lifeless eye and how there's just nothing going on there. Those eyes are not going to be seeing anymore. They're not going to be stealing anymore. And what I love about that shot is it slowly pulls away and you see Marion Crane dead, and the camera pans over, goes into her bedroom in the motel, and you see the newspaper that's hiding the money on the table, and then the camera moves again to out the window where we see Norman's mind has regained control of his body, and now he's realizing that his mother has committed this horrible murder, and like the dutiful son that he is, he begins cleaning up his mother's mess. And he gathers up Marion's body and throws it in the trunk of her car. He takes all of her clothes. He takes the newspaper that's hiding the money and just tosses it away. And what's really interesting about this scene is that we're shown the newspaper with the money again and again and again. I think it's 4 separate shots that we get to see this money that she stole. The whole reason that she's at the motel is that she stole this money, and it's just there, sitting there. The equivalent of $120,000 is sitting in that newspaper, and all Norman does is picks it up and tosses it in the suitcase, tosses it in the car. He didn't even know the money was there. It has zero effect on the fact that Marion was murdered, and that's fascinating because when she goes missing and Arbogast, the private investigator, is looking for her, he's completely convinced that the only reason that she would have been killed or gone missing was because of all of this money. Because she had all this money, that's why she would be killed, right? Well, unfortunately, she met Norman Bates, who was attracted to her, and then Norma became jealous and killed her so that she could maintain control over her son. So I really liked that we're shown the newspaper again and again and again, because to us, this is really important. The money is important. It's just sitting there, but to Norman, it's not important. He doesn't care about money. He cares about spending time with other people, maybe branching out a little bit, and spending time with this beautiful woman who came to his motel. But the mother is very jealous, and then we get the murder that we get. The shower scene by far is the most famous of this scene. I've seen it spoofed. I've seen it paid homage to in a lot of other films. And then obviously the music of that scene where it's like, dah, dah, dah. Oh my goodness, that music is just chilling. It's been copied and done again and again and again in the 60 years since it has come out. It is just so impactful, so groundbreaking. Everything about that scene, if I remember reading right, that scene took about a week to film. I think that includes when Norman is cleaning up after the murder has been committed, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It could be just the shower stuff alone. Now, as important to cinema as the shower scene is, I don't even think that's the best scene of the movie. To go to the best scene of the movie, you gotta rewind like 10 minutes when Marion and Norma are eating supper. She's eating a sandwich and they're just talking. This is my favorite scene of the movie. I think it's the most intricate. I think it's the most layered. I think it has the most to say. When Marion suggests that Norman takes his mother into an asylum and he lashes out at her, you have to think, after having seen the movie, is this Norman who's responding this way? Or is this the mother who's taking over Norman's mind in that time to defend herself, to say, no, I'm not being put in one of those places? But using Norman's voice, right? We have to think about these things now. When you watch it back a second time, when is it Norman? When is it Norma? Is it only Norma when he dresses up like her and uses her voice? I'm not 100% convinced that that's the case. I am convinced, however, that Norma knows that she's of two minds within Norman's body, and then makes a plan to completely, like a hostile takeover, and get rid of Norman. And that's why we get the scene at the very end where she's saying to herself, well, she wouldn't even harm a fly. And I love that ending, by the way. I'm getting a little bit distracted, but I think that's just a fantastic ending to this movie. It's one of my favorite endings to a film of all time. It's just so interesting to get inside the mind of Norma Bates and just seeing Norman sit there with the blanket around his shoulders and a fly on his hand and looks at the camera and gives that creepy smile, and we get a little bit of a skeleton kind of drifting in, like it's just fades in and out, and then it goes away. It's such a fantastic final scene for a movie. It's really wonderful. But going back to the scene where they're having supper and talking about the asylum and taxidermy, all of the pieces are there. Everything about how Norman's mind works, what he does, how he exhumed his mother's body and tried to preserve it as much as he can, all of that is in that scene. All the pieces are there that you can put it together, and it's in that scene that you realize that maybe Marion Crane is not the psycho, because at this point we are a quarter of the way through the movie, and we are only just being introduced to Norman Bates as a character. He's just coming in. You think maybe he's just a character that's coming in and out. But no, that's not the case. He's the psycho that the title is referring to. When you see the opening titles of the movie and the letters are splitting apart, that's meant to represent Norman's mind is of two minds and he's split. But up until this point, because you haven't met him yet and you're watching just Marion and you see the things that she's doing with her eyes while she's driving and she's smiling, you say, okay, she's the psycho. The money has driven her mad and who knows what she's going to do because of this money. But that's not the case. But then you meet the police officer, and maybe the police officer's the psycho because he keeps following her. And then you meet Norman Bates, and then you realize, okay, I think he's the psycho, and what is going to happen here? And then Janet Leigh, who plays Marion Crane, she is murdered about a third into the movie. And then all of a sudden, her character doesn't matter. Her storyline is over. The money doesn't matter. The money was the inciting incident of this entire story, and now it's just completely irrelevant, and I think that that is so brilliant, that this is a crime of passion that happens to intersect with a crime of greed. And so that's why that's my favorite scene in the movie. I think it's so good. I love those character moments where you really get to know who the people are and why they are the way that they are. So that's why it's my favorite scene in the movie. I think we're getting close to the end of my notes here. All I really have is a long list of trivia that I want to talk about. So this movie is groundbreaking in a lot of ways. It is the first movie to ever feature a flushing toilet on screen, which is an interesting piece of trivia. I think a lot of people know that. I think that's pretty common knowledge at this point. But if you didn't know it, now you do. When Alfred Hitchcock bought the rights for this movie, it only cost him $9,000. I didn't do the inflation calculation on that, so I don't know what that would cost these days, but that seems pretty cheap. But then what he did after that is, after he had the rights to the book to make the movie, he went and bought out as many of the books as he could so that people couldn't read the book before seeing the movie, so that they wouldn't be spoiled by the dramatic ending. And I think that's pretty interesting that he did that. And in a world of no internet, that's a pretty effective strategy, I think. when the movie was coming out into theaters, they were very strict on not letting anyone enter the movie late. You had to be exactly on time because Alfred Hitchcock didn't want the illusion of the film to be ruined by someone coming in late and crossing in front of you. He wanted everyone to just be ensconced by his film. And so for that, there was no late entries. What's interesting is that Janet Leigh, who plays Marion Crane, who's murdered in the shower, when they were filming the shower scene, she was totally fine. She wasn't really freaked out by it. But when she saw the final film and she saw herself being murdered in the shower, it really struck a chord with her, and she was really disturbed by it. And so for the rest of her life, she only took baths. No more showers for Janet Leigh. She turned into a bath girl. And that's really interesting that filming the scene wasn't the problem. It was watching it when it was complete, with the music, with the editing, all of it coming together. That's what set her off. And then lastly, my little bit of trivia. Alfred Hitchcock always puts himself in his movies. He has a cameo, and he was pretty famous for this at the time. And everyone knew that Alfred Hitchcock was going to show up somewhere in that movie. Kind of like these days when you watch a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie and you know Stan Lee is going to pop up in there somewhere. But because Alfred Hitchcock was so famous for this, he stuck his cameo very early in the movie. I think it's 3 or 4 minutes into the film, and you see him on screen there. And the reason that he did this is because he didn't want anyone to be distracted by looking for him and where he was going to pop up in the movie. So he stuck himself right at the beginning so that people could see him, get it over with, and then be just once again ensconced and entranced by the film and completely invested in what was going on in front of him. There's a whole lot of other trivia about this movie and about the making of this movie. If you want, you can watch Hitchcock, which is about the making of Psycho. I recommend watching Psycho first so you understand kind of where this is coming from. But I think that's going to be pretty much it for this review. So I'm going to start wrapping things up here. So my question for you guys is, have you seen Psycho? Do you like it? If you don't like it, I would love to know what about it doesn't strike with you. I know some people just don't like older movies. And if that's the reason, then that's fine, I guess. It's fine. Everything's fine. But yeah, have you seen Psycho? Do you like it? Please let me know. You can reach out to me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Pottle Nathan, and you can follow the show on Instagram at Movies Are Awesome Podcast. If you haven't done so, please feel free to subscribe to the show. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and a whole bunch of other places. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this Halloween edition of Movies Are Awesome. Stay tuned for next week, where I'm going to talk about something. I haven't quite decided what next week's going to be about yet, so stay tuned for that. And as always, if you have nothing else to do, go watch more movies.